Hi everyone, welcome to another session of the Research Consortium. I'm Dr. Angelo Gomez, and today we're going to talk about coding. Coding is probably there's not much justice to be done to a process that could be discussed for days and days. However, coding needs to be understood as it's meant to be. Something really big that becomes really small but quite meaningful. So for this presentation, I'm going to divide it in three sections. The first part is the introduction to the notion of coding. Part two, the types, ways we can go about coding. And the part three of this presentation refers to some books that I have next to me here to share with you about what these authors say about coding. First of all, what is coding? Coding is the identification of units of meaning. That probably would be the general description of code. The idea is that from the data that we obtain from participants, usually through conversations, we transcribe those conversations to the best of our ability with all the bells and whistles that correspond to the nuances of oral communication, and we transform it into written language. Once we have the transcription, we want to find what are the meanings that are hidden within the text, both explicitly, implicitly, and behind the text. So what coding is? Coding is finding those units of meaning that are found through the collection of sentences, through the collection of phrases, through the collection of paragraphs, through by the meaning that is behind the text that we have in front of us, and finally by the components that make up the story, the meaning of the whole story that is behind of what we hear from the participants, which most of the time we co-construct with them by means of the question that we prompt them to elicit information in form of stories, descriptions, analysis, interpretations, feelings, or emotions. How can we go about coding? Well, coding could be done in two different ways methodologically. One is the traditional way, which is to print a document and do it manually by using highlighters, by selecting the document into the pieces that we find the meaning is there, by tagging the document in different sections, by maybe if it was a word processor, having the document in one side and pulling the ideas, words, sentences on the other and grouping them according to what criteria we may use. The other way to go about coding is through technology. And currently we have multiple kinds of software systems that may be used. The three most common were Nudist, Atlas, and NVivo. At the university here we use NVivo as the preferred software system. There are advantages and disadvantages for the manual versus the software system processing of coding. The manual can give us a more visual expansion of what we have done. By printing and reprinting and having multiple copies, we could spread them around maybe in a room, in our office, in our personal places where we have the opportunity to have all this data printed and reprinted. The disadvantage is that there is not much mobility. We cannot carry multiple copies of our conversations and our cons all over the place where we want to. The other disadvantage is that we may have too many prints out, too many copies of one specific or multiple conversations, and the amount of, instead of reducing the meanings, identifying, we might create more information than we actually have. The disadvantage of the software system is that sometimes we can, or we could, become too cold, too distant with the data. Once we process it, we file it, and we put it away. And because it's outside our vision, presential vision, might not have a contact with it. and we may tend to taxonomize or classify or summarize the data rather than to dig deeper into it. On the other hand, the advantage is that it's very playful. We might be able to play with the data in multiple ways that allow us to find the meaning, what's behind the words that the participants are saying. But regardless, there are advantages and disadvantages for both. But those are the two means. But then, how do we go about coding? How do we create codes? Well, that can be done by the identification of whatever meaning comes up. There are two types of people. Some people are intuitive people. They can see a text and can see the ideas emerging, ideas that become codes, and they're sensitive to nuances of the text and the richness of the text. Other people are not that intuitive. They need prompting, they need guidance, they need preconceived notions which allow them to select, oh, the participants are saying this versus that. For them, I suggest literature. And the literature in qualitative research not only refers to journals, books, and articles, but also maybe a poem, maybe a story, maybe a song that elicits certain meanings or certain ideas that allows the person who is not very intuitive to go into the text and find whether those things are found there. Let's give a more concrete example. Let's suppose that we're trying to do we're doing a qualitative study, phenomenological, and we want to investigate what is it like the experience of being raped for women in college. For people who are not that intuitive, maybe just breaking down the questions when they analyze the text in women, college, rape gives them three areas of understanding and identification within the text. But maybe within the text you find that some participants describe their assailants as aggressive and violent, whereas others were very seductive and led them towards the rape. So then we can break down the assailant into kinds of them, and that allows us to see the text and identify the things within the text. Perhaps for some people, college was the setting, but individuals were not part of college, or it was something unrelated to college. So we have two, at college with college individuals and non-college individuals as assailants. So all those kind of things can now allow us to break down and identify these units of meaning. Also, the participants can allow us during the process of coding by what is called member checking. Members who look at the interpretation of the data or look at the transcription that we have made of the conversations with them, and they can tell us what is evocative to them, what is reminiscent to them, and that allows us to go back to the text and see where those aspects are found, mentioned, or maybe maybe they are behind the text, and that's kind of the spirit of the text, not necessarily what they just said. So the third part, and this could be for hours, is how do we find meaning within a text to create those codes? Well, meaning can be found in multiple ways, but meaning is the construction of understanding that people make or make about their experiences. We can have that in the literature, we can find that in art, we can find that in music, we can find that in our preconceived notions, we can find that through member checking and reinterpretation of data by means of the participants or scholars that relate towards the study that we're carrying out. The third part of the presentation deals with some of the textbooks that I selected for the discussion of coding. As I said, this could take a long time, and in a future presentation I will discuss in more detail the characteristics and the functioning of software systems that are used for coding. Today the presentation is mostly about methodology and conceptualization. So Steiner Carvalho presents a very interesting metaphor about how big data can be, and he talks about the 1,000 pages response. It happens that very often after we transcribe conversation with the participant, the amount of data can be absolutely overwhelming. And for the novice researcher, he can get lost at sea without being able to land at port or find a bay where to harbor. For them, this piece of advice: while we have plenty of information and maybe multiple hundreds, maybe even thousands of pages of transcripts, at the end, we want to reduce that information to the basic components that make up the experience that we want to describe, or at the basic elements that fully answer the question that we have asked. As a trained phenomenologist, we always look at the essences. What is essential? What is it that without which we cannot be what we are? And that's a good way to stop, in a way to aim at what we need to do at the end. On the other hand, we don't want to just create a few codes and then philosophize about the possible thematization process. And that's what coding leads to the process of thematization. And thematization is a process of grouping, combining, or compressing codes under the umbrella of a theme, which is an essential component of an experience that allows us to describe it or explain it to others. Themes, in my rule of thumb, is between 3 to 5. We should be very cautious that at the end the reader cannot read as many pages as we have. Well, we may be very interested in our 1,000 pages, such as Cavalli metaphorically discusses, but not necessarily the audience that we're intending to share with our study. So essentially, we want to go to the most bare basic bones of what the experience is, or what constitutes the experience, or what serves to explain the experience for others to understand it. So, some of the books, the final part of this presentation, some of the books that may be helpful for many of you to read are Analyzing Qualitative Data, Systematic Approaches by Russell Bernard and Jerry Ryan. What do I like about this book? Most of them, the books are from Sage Publications. Is that data not only is about the information that we have, but the information that we make. There are plenty of books for data collection, data analysis, but essentially the concept is the same. How do we make sense of what we are trying to study or the questions that we are trying to answer? There are multiple ways how coding can be processed, but what is important to understand is that they must make sense and they need to be structured. Coding is like building a pyramid. For the hundreds and hundreds of pieces you have at the bottom, you want to go as high and as pointed as possible at the end. Not always you will end up with one single theme. Most of the time it will be several. But at least you know that as most pyramid, there will be 4 corners, 5 corners, or 3 corners, which are the basis upon which you make the final interpretation or description. Another book that I suggest for you to review is An Introduction to Qualitative Research. I have read the 3rd edition of Uwe Flink, who is a German qualitative researcher. And something that I really like about him is when he describes the notions of data. Data is more than just words, more than just the written piece, but also figures of visuals, imagery, and other elements. And very importantly, something that scholars always remind us, while we may decide on a set of codes based on our personal desires or experience, at the end we always need to correlate it with what the literature informs us. It is common that sometimes the coding are done in a very arbitrary way. based exclusively on the researcher. But sometimes we forget the literature can inform us that our preconceived notions or ideas have been based on what we have heard, what we have read, or what has been previously published. So we are not the first one to come out with those ideas. Another book that I suggest to read for those interested in case study is Qualitative Research from Start to Finish by Robert Young. What this book offers for those interested in research, particularly in terms of coding, is the notion that cases are systems. In a system, they're bonded together. So the coding project is eventually to describe a bonded, concerted groups of codes that come together to create a system. And the system is bonded with the elements that are made up that system. Kind of philosophical, but it's true. On chapter number 6, he talks about data collection methods. And in chapter 8, analyzing qualitative data, compiling and disassembling and reassembling. Very interesting the notion that Ian proposes, that we disassemble those conversations, those transcripts that we obtain, and we reassemble back again in order to see whether it goes back to the form that we originally found. Chapter 9, analyzing qualitative 2, interpreting and concluding, which is very interesting about coding. Sometimes we don't think that coding has to do with the final possible interpretation. As we disintegrate, we integrate back again, and hopefully we do exactly, or we get similar to what we initially obtained through the conversations. A classical book that I think it will be very useful for many of the participants, and all this book will be accompanied to the handout that goes with each one of these presentations, is called An Expanded Sourcebook, Qualitative Data Analysis by Matthew Miles and Michael Huberman. Perhaps this is an older edition, but what I find really interesting is that data has to do with more than just grouping things together. Sometimes we need to explore and describe, as he mentions in chapter 7. Sometimes we need to order and explain, as he mentions in chapter 8. And sometimes we need to explain and predict, or sometimes explain and describe. So interestingly, coding is about meaning making process. And from the constructive paradigm is to co-construct the meaning with the participants. Within the postmodernist approach, though, it's not only about what we think or the participants think or what we make up or what the participants make up, but how our interpretation of reality sometimes is confronted, debunked, supported, or transformed by the outer realities in which we live, the societal realities that exist at a larger scale than our own personal perceptions within the world or worlds in which we live. Another book that that I would suggest for our people to read, and it's the third edition, and I think they make a little bit of a transformation here, is Qualitative Data Analysis Method Sourcebook, is that the idea of coding is trying to make good sense. We dissect the larger component of this information, which are the transcripts, into smaller pieces. And those smaller pieces allow us to make sense of all the nitty-gritty of those words into what is it that they're really telling me. What is it that really this experience is like? What is it that this experience is about? And how does this experience come to be what it is for those who live it? It goes without mentioning that I highly recommend Research Design, Qualitative, Quantitative, and Mixed Methods Approach, 4th edition by Creswell. Why? I find Creswell incredibly engaging and great at organizing, particularly for beginners researchers. So in summary, what we have talked about today. Coding refers to the analysis through the initial interpretation of data, usually by looking and analyzing the transcript of conversations. We find encoding is intended the basic unique elements within a conversation, some relevant to our question, some not. Furthermore, what we have is the notion of putting it all together, summarizing the concepts, and lastly, making sense out about the experience, making sense of what it means to be part of this process. Like the example that I gave of the pyramid, the multiple pieces into the maximum piece, which most of the time is not one single thing, but actually multiple themes that make up what a human experience is. I suggest that always make sure that read beyond what the text says and find meaning in the pieces that are not being said but that are intended within the text. Meaning is not just what we say, what we are not, but also what we are not capable of saying, or what is hidden behind the limitations of language, social conventions, of lack of awareness. Good luck in the qualitative research process. I hope that whatever you choose to do for coding, manually or using a software, can lead you to a rich description, interpretation, and analysis of any human lived experience for a reader who can learn about that experience. Thank you.